Tonight we'll drift through 6 simple dishes, each one a quiet comfort from a kitchen past. Some came from seaside cafes, others from humble staff rooms or early morning bakeries, but all of them in their own way are soft steps toward rest. So settle in, breathe deeply, and let the warmth of familiar flavors guide you gently towards sleep. The first recipe is cinnamon French toast with maple syrup. There was a pastry chef I worked under in Montreal, older, with hands that moved like he'd lived 1,000 kitchens. On quiet winter mornings, he'd stand by the back window of the bakery, watching snow fall like flour from the sky. He used to say French toast isn't a recipe, it's an apology, soft, sweet, and slow. And every snow day, without fail, he'd make it. Not for the menu, not for the guests, just for the staff. Those were the best mornings. The whole city blanketed in hush. The early deliveries delayed, the rush softened by the weather. You could hear the radiators creak, the light hum of the mixer, and in the background, the sound of eggs being cracked. He always started with the bread day old brioche, if he had it. Challah, if not, it had to be slightly stale. That was his rule. Fresh bread floats, he'd say. Old bread listens. He'd slice it thick, nearly 2 fingers wide, then leave the pieces on a wire rack while he prepared the custard. He never called it batter. It was always custard. Eggs first. 4, sometimes 5, depending on how many mouths needed warming. Into a wide bowl they went, with a steady hand and no rush. Then the milk, whole cold, poured with precision. A splash of cream if it was on hand. The whisking was gentle, not frothy. Just enough to blend the yolks and whites into the pale gold of early morning. Then the cinnamon, 2 pinches, maybe 3, stirred in so it bloomed slowly through the mix. And a whisper of nutmeg, grated fresh from a little wooden mill, he kept in his apron pocket. I remember how the kitchen would fill with the scent of it, cinnamon and cream, bread soaking quietly on a tray. He'd never rush that part. Each slice needed time, needed to sit and absorb, until it was heavy with warmth, like a blanket draped over cold shoulders. The pan was always cast iron. He'd heat it slowly, then add a bit of butter, letting it melt the edges before placing the bread in 1 slice at a time, as if tucking them in for a nap. The sizzle was soft, not sharp. If it shouts, the pan's too hot, he used to say. He never flipped them too soon. He waited until the underside turned golden and crisp at the edges, like the top of a good creme brulee. Then he'd turn them gently, letting the second side brown just as patiently. The smell by then was rich and sweet and full of memory. And then, just before serving, he'd warm the maple syrup, not boil, just warm. Cold syrup is cruel, he once said with a smile. He kept a small enamel pot just for it, letting the syrup loosen and shine, ready to pour like silk over the toast. He never stacked them high, just 2 slices, side by side, on a warm plate, with a quiet drizzle of syrup that pooled around the corners. Sometimes he'd add a pat of butter on top, just to melt slowly, like snow on warm stone. We'd eat them standing, leaning against counters or stools, steam rising into the dim light of the prep room. No one spoke much on those mornings. We just chewed slowly, letting the warmth soak in. The toast was soft in the center, crisp at the edge, sweet with cinnamon and maple. It felt like an apology for all the long nights, the burnt fingers, the missed breaks. And somehow that made it taste better. I still make it on snow days. Or even just the quiet ones, those evenings when the world feels a little far away, and all you want is to feel held. I slice the bread thick, whisk the eggs slow, heat the pan with care. I don't measure much anymore. I go by feel, like he taught me, and as the slices sizzle and the syrup warms, I remember those Montreal mornings, the cold outside, the warmth within, the hush of snow, the scent of cinnamon, the soft, sweet apology of French toast. So if tonight calls for comfort, and the day has been long, or cold, or just a little heavy, crack a few eggs, slice some bread, let it soak, let it sizzle. Pour warm maple syrup slowly, like snow melting from branches. And with each bite, let yourself feel the hush. Let the warmth carry you. Let the quiet settle in. And sleep, soft, sweet, and slow, will follow, just like the snow always did. That was recipe 1. The second recipe is Herbert cream cheese and cucumber sandwiches. I learnt to make these in a kitchen that smelled of lemon polish and dry roses. A countryside manor tucked behind hedges that bloomed all the way into September. The staff wore pressed whites, and the silver was buffed until it caught even the faintest candlelight. But the food, especially the afternoon tea, was all about restraint. There, everything had its place. The scones, the jam, the little cakes cut with the care of a jeweler. And nestled between it all were the cucumber sandwiches, pale, simple, almost silent in their elegance. The cook who taught me had worked there since she was 16. She used to say, "Keep them light. People want a bite, not a burden." And so we did. She always started with the cream cheese. It had to sit out on the counter first, just long enough to lose its chill, to soften into something you could coax rather than command. Into a bowl it went, followed by a handful of herbs, chopped so fine they almost turned to paste. Dill, mostly, a bit of chive, sometimes tarragon if it was growing wild by the garden wall. The mix was stirred slowly, gently, with the back of a wooden spoon, not whipped, just folded, so the cream stayed thick and the herbs stayed bright. The cucumbers came next, always English, always peeled. She sliced them thin enough that the blade barely made a sound. No thicker than a whisper, she used to say. And once they were sliced, she'd lay them between cloths, soft linen, not paper, pressing them just enough to draw out the water. No one wants a soggy sandwich at tea. Then came the bread. White, square, the crusts trimmed with the steady confidence of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. We never toasted it. That would have been sacrilege. Instead, each slice was given a thin veil of the Herbert cheese, edge to edge, as if painting a canvas with calm. Then the cucumbers, layered like fallen leaves, overlapping slightly but never crowding. Each one placed, not scattered. When two halves met, the sandwich was pressed, just enough to hold, but not enough to crush. She cut them in neat rectangles, 2 fingers wide, and lined them up like dominoes on porcelain trays. The whole process was deliberate, measured, almost meditative. I remember the quiet of those afternoons. The soft clink of china, the whisper of footsteps on old stone, the distant rustle of ivy on the windows. Guests would nibble at the edges, sip tea, talk in low voices. And through it all, the cucumber sandwiches remained simple, cool, and strangely perfect. These days I make them when the world feels a bit too loud. I chop the herbs slowly, take my time with the cucumbers. I leave the crusts off without apology. There's something profoundly calming about it, this act of assembling something so light, so gentle, with care. Sometimes I'll add a twist, a dash of lemon zest to the cream cheese, or a touch of black pepper over the cucumbers. But never too much, never enough to tip the balance. Because these sandwiches aren't meant to impress. They're meant to remind us that food doesn't have to shout to be meaningful. Sometimes it's the quiet dishes that stay with us longest. So, if the evening feels heavy, or the day left your shoulders tight, slice some bread, stir herbs into soft cheese, lay down your cucumbers one by one. And with each step, let the pace of things slow. No rush, no pressure, just lightness, just care, just the soft rhythm of something small done well. And when it's time, take a bite. Cool, crisp, calm. Then let that calm stay with you. Carry it into the quiet of your room. the stillness of your breath. Let it settle on your chest like a soft linen cloth, and sleep will come, light as a whisper, gentle as a well-made sandwich. That was recipe 2. The third recipe is oatmeal. My dad never cooked, at least not the way chefs do. He didn't own a cookbook, never used measuring spoons, and barely knew where the salt lived. But there was one thing he made, only one, and it was perfect. Oatmeal. Not the quick kind, not out of a packet. No, his was the old-fashioned sort. Rolled oats stirred into simmering milk, sweetened just so, finished with a knob of butter, so rich it glazed the top like satin. He only made it on cold nights. The wind would start its song against the windows, that long whistling moan that curled under the doors, and he'd say, "Oats will keep the cold out of your dreams." He used the same dented saucepan every time, a battered little thing with a wooden handle that had grown smooth from years of use. I don't know where it came from. Maybe it had been his mother's, or maybe it just lasted longer than it had any right to. But in that pan, something ordinary became something sacred. He'd start by warming the milk. Always whole milk. He said skim was for cats, not children. The pan would sit on the back burner, low heat, never rushed. And he'd stir it now and then, leaning on the counter with a kind of quiet patience that was rare for him. Then came the oats, just a small scoop from the jar he kept near the flour. He never said how much, just poured until it felt right. And in they went, raining into the milk like tiny promises. He'd stir them in gently, slowly, until they thickened, until the spoon started to drag a little with each turn. That smell, warm grain and cream, would fill the whole house. It softened the edges of everything. The drafty windows didn't feel so harsh. The long, dark halls didn't seem so wide. It was like someone had tucked the house in, just like he was about to tuck me in. Once it was just the right consistency, not too thick, never runny. He'd ladle it into 2 bowls, one for me, one for him, and then came the finishing touches. A pat of butter, golden and cool, dropped into the middle like a prize. A sprinkle of brown sugar, never stirred in all the way, so you'd get little pockets of sweetness. Unexpected and bright. Sometimes, if he felt fancy, he'd shave a bit of cinnamon over the top, but only sometimes. We never ate it at the table. No, we'd sit on the old sofa, legs wrapped in blankets, bowls warm in our hands. The wind would still howl outside, but it couldn't reach us, not with oats in our bellies, and the butter melting slow. He didn't say much while we ate, but every now and then he'd look over and smile. Not big, not flashy, just enough to let you know he was glad to be there, that he was proud of what he made, even if it was just oats. Years later, in kitchens full of copper pans and polished knives, I'd still think of that saucepan. I never learned how to fix the dent. I never wanted to. It had character. It had history. It had oatmeal in its bones. Now, when the nights feel sharp, I do the same. I warm the milk slow, stir in the oats with care. I wait until the steam curls soft and sweet. Then I spoon it into a bowl, drop in the butter, let the sugar rest on top like snow, and I eat it quietly, remembering the man who made it first. I remember how he never once rushed it, how he used food not to impress, but to protect, how one humble bowl could make you feel safe, even when the wind wouldn't stop. And maybe that's all we really need before bed. Not grandeur, not noise, just warmth, just a little sweetness, just the sound of a spoon stirring something simple in a saucepan that's seen more than most. So if the night is cold and the silence long, make yourself a bowl, let the milk warm slow and steady, let the oats rise and swell, add the butter, the sugar, and maybe a memory or two of someone who made you feel cared for. And as you finish the last spoonful, let the warmth follow you to your blanket, to your breath, to your dreams. Sleep easy now, the wind can't find you here. That was recipe 3. The 4th recipe, chocolate mug cake with a pinch of sea salt. There was a tired night in a flat above a bakery in Dublin. One of those bone-deep, weary nights where even the light switch feels far away. I remember it vividly, not because of anything grand or dramatic, but because of what we made with almost nothing. The bakery below had closed hours before. The ovens had long since cooled, and the scent of croissants and rye loaves had faded into the wooden beams. Upstairs it was quiet. Cold tiles, one flickering bulb in the kitchenette, and 3 young bakers collapsed after the shift of a lifetime. We opened the fridge in hope, only to find disappointment. A near-empty carton of milk, some butter, a few eggs we'd saved for morning. But on the shelf above the kettle was a half-used tin of cocoa, and beside it, a little jar of sea salt someone had brought back from a trip to the coast. In the cabinet, a bag of flour, sugar, and just enough baking powder. That was all. And that's when someone, maybe Liam, maybe me, muttered, "I bet we could make cake in a mug." It sounded absurd. But absurdity is the seed of invention, especially when you're hungry. We didn't measure precisely, just spooned with instinct and memory. A few tablespoons of flour into a mismatched mug. A spoon and a half of cocoa, dark and bitter, sugar to soften the edge, a pinch of baking powder, then a little splash of milk, enough to make it stir. 1 egg, a dollop of butter, melted quick in the microwave. We stirred with a fork, the way you would a late-night thought, lazy but thorough. And then came the sea salt, just a tiny pinch between 2 fingers. That's when I knew it might actually be something. Salt sharpens chocolate, you see, brings out its shadows, gives it shape. It's the secret that turns a quick fix into a little act of art. We put the mug in the microwave, holding our breath like it was a souffle. 60 seconds. Then 10 more. The smell hit first, rich, warm, like the bakery had come alive again just for us. We each took a spoon. The top was soft, the middle gooey like warm truffle, and the bottom held just a bit of that molten chocolate shimmer. We passed it around like communion. No plates, no manners, just heat and sweetness and steam on the window panes. And for that moment, we felt rich. Not because it was fancy. It wasn't. But because it was ours, because we turned flour and fatigue into something worth remembering. I've made hundreds of desserts since. Triple-tiered torte, brulee with sugar crusts so delicate they crack like thin ice. But that mug cake, eaten half sitting, half lying on a lopsided couch in a room barely warmer than the outside air, taught me more about comfort than any kitchen ever did. Now some nights when the world is quiet and I don't want to think too hard, I reach for a mug. I spoon in flour, just 2 heaping ones. Cocoa, sugar, and a little baking powder. An egg if I have one. A splash of milk, a bit of melted butter. Stir slowly, like I'm remembering. Then that pinch of sea salt, always the salt. And into the microwave it goes. It puffs up like memory, rising just enough to remind me that small things can still surprise you. That warmth can come from the simplest places. That cake doesn't need a celebration. It can be the celebration. So if tonight you're tired, if your kitchen is dim and your cupboard's nearly bare, don't let that stop you. Make the cake, stir slowly, trust your instincts, and don't forget the salt. Because sometimes when the night is long and your feet are sore, the richest thing in the world is a warm mug in your hand, chocolate on your tongue, and silence in your heart. Sleep well now. There's sweetness in the quiet. That was recipe 4. The 5th recipe is soft-boiled eggs with toast soldiers. My mentor used to say that a great chef isn't measured by the complexity of their creations, but by the reverence they show to the simplest of things. And to him, There was no test more sacred than the egg. He believed you had to master eggs 5 ways before you touched anything else: scrambled, poached, fried, omelette, and soft-boiled. But of those 5, soft-boiled was the quietest challenge. And in his words, the one that whispered restraint. Because in that small shell was a clock you had to feel, not watch. He showed me how on a rainy morning in a countryside kitchen, where the windows fogged and the kettle never quite stopped humming, he handed me a pot, an egg, and a timer, then pointed to the stove and said, "Don't overthink it. Listen." I filled the saucepan with just enough water to cover an egg by a fingertip, not too much. Brought it to a boil, then turned the flame down to a low burble, gentle enough that the water shifted, but never jumped. In went the egg, and we waited. 6 minutes, that was his number. No more, no less, he said. An egg has all it needs. Your job is just to know when to stop. While the egg sat in the water, we sliced bread. He favored a crusty loaf, something with a bit of bite, cut into long strips just wide enough for dipping. Soldiers, he called them, as though breakfast were a small, quiet campaign. Into the toaster they went, then out and onto the board for a generous swipe of butter, while the toast was still sighing steam. When the timer chirped barely a whisper, we lifted the egg out and ran it under cool water for a breath, just to stop the cooking. The shell was warm and fragile in my palm, like holding a secret. He showed me how to tap the top, peel just a cap away, and sprinkle the golden center with a few flakes of salt and a twist of pepper. No spoon, no flourish, just toast soldiers standing by, waiting to dip into that soft, yielding heart. I'll never forget the look on his face as he took that first bite. Not pride, not critique, just stillness. A quiet satisfaction that only comes from knowing you've done something precisely as it should be, with nothing extra and nothing missing. Over the years, I've made soft-boiled eggs in hotel suites, on campfires, and in kitchens with stars in their guidebook. But no matter the place or the audience, the ritual remains unchanged. 6 minutes, cool water, crack, peel, dip, and always the toast soldiers. There's something comforting about the way they line up on the plate. Something grounding in the act of dipping. One hand on the egg, one hand on the toast, balance held in simple motions. Now, some nights when the air is still and the world feels too loud, I make myself one, maybe 2. I bring the water to a low simmer, lower the eggs in gently, and count the minutes with quiet patience. The toast pops up, and I butter it slowly, watching the gold melt into the crevice. And when I sit down alone, maybe, or with someone I love, beside me, I tap the top of the egg, like knocking softly on an old door, and I'm back in that quiet kitchen, with rain tapping on the window, and my mentor watching from the stove. There's peace in the ordinary, in the way the yolk yields, in the crisp edge of the toast, in the knowing pause before the first dip. So if you're still awake tonight, if you're craving something warm and gentle and true, you might try it for yourself. Just an egg, a pot of water, a slice of bread, and a few minutes of your time. It won't ask much of you, but it'll give back more than you'd expect. Sleep softly now. Let restraint carry you, like a spoon over warm yolk. That was recipe 5. The 6th recipe is coconut rice with toasted almonds and a touch of vanilla. There's a street corner in Chiang Mai where the lanterns glow low and the air smells of jasmine and charcoal. I used to walk past it every evening after service, tired, sticky with sweat, and too wired from the rush of the kitchen to think about sleep. That's where I met her, the woman with the rice. She had a simple cart, nothing fancy, just a wide silver pot, the kind that whispered steam from its lid, and a stack of paper bowls beside it. The sign didn't say much, just coconut rice, sweet dreams, hand-painted in lilac script. Curious, I asked her once why the name. She smiled with her whole face and said, "I make it for my children. when they cannot sleep. Warm rice is like warm arms. It holds you. And then she ladled a scoop into a bowl for me. Fluffy, fragrant, with the gentlest shimmer of coconut cream and a sprinkle of toasted almonds on top. I never forgot it. Not just the flavor, but the way it settled something in me. As if the dish carried lullabies in the steam. It's a dish I now make when the night feels longer than the day, when the world won't quiet down on its own. I start by rinsing the rice jasmine, always jasmine, until the water runs clear. That's important, she told me. It clears away the noise of the day. Into the pot, I pour equal parts water and full-fat coconut milk, with just a little less liquid than usual, to keep the texture tender, not soupy. A pinch of salt goes in, and then just before covering it, a half teaspoon of pure vanilla extract, not too much, enough to wrap around the rice like a breeze through silk. While it steams, I toast the almonds. Low heat, dry pan, stir gently. They'll let you know when they're ready, not by turning golden, but by releasing that warm, nutty aroma that feels like being near a hearth. I always toast a few extra. You'll want them later. When the rice is done, I don't fluff it right away. I let it sit under the lid for 5 minutes. Let it breathe, let it rest. Cooking, like dreaming, needs patience. Then I gently lift the lid. The coconut has turned the grains creamy and tender, and the vanilla has nestled into every fold. It smells like sweetness and stillness. Into a bowl it goes, not packed, not rushed, just a gentle mound. A drizzle more of warm coconut milk on top, and a scattering of those toasted almonds. If I'm feeling nostalgic, maybe a few golden raisins or a dusting of cinnamon. But most nights, I leave it simple, pure, like she did. Sometimes I think of her children, curled under thin blankets, listening to night sounds while she stirred the pot and sang under her breath. I like to think they remember it, not just the taste, but the calm. And now, when I have a quiet bowl of my own, I sit by the window, the steam rising slowly, and I breathe in that warmth. The rice doesn't talk, but it comforts. It doesn't rush, but it reassures. Each spoonful is like a soft murmur. You've done enough. Rest now. So if you're restless tonight, if your thoughts keep walking long after your body's laid down, this might be the thing. Just a bowl of coconut rice. Gentle, vanilla scented, almond crisped, like warm arms, and perhaps in the hush after the last bite, your breath will slow, your shoulders will drop. The night will soften around you, and sleep will come quietly, the way rice steams steadily, tenderly, without fuss. That was recipe 6. Having trouble sleeping. I was once young and ambitious and had many sleepless nights. When I need to fall asleep, I may read, I may have a snack, but I always pull back fond memories to soothe my mind. Never of my restaurant and achieving my Michelin stars, but always of my first week at Hotel St. George, or learning the way to truly cook at the Box Tree. And finally, when I became a man at Le Gavroche. Search for your own memories, forget the troubles awaiting you, and drift off keeping in mind these recipes for sleep. Having trouble sleeping. I was once young and ambitious and had many sleepless nights. When I need to fall asleep, I may read, I may have a snack, but I always pull back fond memories to soothe my mind. Never of my restaurant and achieving my Michelin stars, but always of my first week at Hotel St. George, or learning the way to truly cook at the Box Tree. And finally, when I became a man at Le Gavroche. Search for your own memories, forget the troubles awaiting you, and drift off keeping in mind these recipes for sleep. having trouble sleeping. I was once young and ambitious and had many sleepless nights. When I need to fall asleep, I may read, I may have a snack, but I always pull back fond memories to soothe my mind. Never of my restaurant and achieving my Michelin stars, but always of my first week at Hotel St. George, or learning the way to truly cook at the Box Tree. And finally, when I became a man at Le Gavroche. Search for your own memories, forget the troubles awaiting you, and drift off keeping in mind these recipes for sleep. having trouble sleeping. I was once young and ambitious and had many sleepless nights. When I need to fall asleep, I may read, I may have a snack, but I always pull back fond memories to soothe my mind. Never of my restaurant and achieving my Michelin stars, but always of my first week at Hotel St. George, or learning the way to truly cook at the Box Tree. And finally, when I became a man at Le Gavroche. Search for your own memories, forget the troubles awaiting you, and drift off keeping in mind these recipes for sleep. Having trouble sleeping. I was once young and ambitious and had many sleepless nights. When I need to fall asleep, I may read, I may have a snack, but I always pull back fond memories to soothe my mind. Never of my restaurant and achieving my Michelin stars, but always of my first week at Hotel St. George, or learning the way to truly cook at the Box Tree. And finally, when I became a man at Le Gavroche. Search for your own memories, forget the troubles awaiting you, and drift off keeping in mind these recipes for sleep. Having trouble sleeping. I was once young and ambitious and had many sleepless nights. When I need to fall asleep, I may read, I may have a snack, but I always pull back fond memories to soothe my mind. Never of my restaurant and achieving my Michelin stars, but always of my first week at Hotel St. George, or learning the way to truly cook at the Box Tree. And finally, when I became a man at Le Gavroche. Search for your own memories, forget the troubles awaiting you, and drift off keeping in mind these recipes for sleep. Having trouble sleeping. I was once young and ambitious and had many sleepless nights. When I need to fall asleep, I may read, I may have a snack, but I always pull back fond memories to soothe my mind. Never of my restaurant and achieving my Michelin stars, but always of my first week at Hotel St. George, or learning the way to truly cook at the Box Tree. And finally, when I became a man at Le Gavroche. Search for your own memories, forget the troubles awaiting you, and drift off keeping in mind these recipes for sleep.